Welcome. It's nice to have you back. We just heard from Adam Broadbent at Link & Co. and Søren Stekmes from Arvato Financial Solutions. And now we're going to take a look at mobility as a service and the ways that it could be purchased in the future. We have Scot Wingo. He is a serial entrepreneur, an expert in retail and e-commerce, cars, and the Vehicle 2.0. Please welcome the member of the Forbes Technology Council and CEO of Spiffy, live from North Carolina. Before we get started, Scot, I just want to remind our viewers that you can again go on our website and send Scot your questions, and we will answer them then after his talk. So without further ado, Scot.
Awesome. Thanks for having me today. I'm excited to talk about how are we going to buy mobility in the future. So some of the topics I want to cover today is a little bit about my background so you can understand where I'm coming from as it relates to predicting the future of cars. Tell you a little bit about the rapidly changing consumer behavior. I come from the e-commerce world, and the core principles that decide what's going to happen come from changing consumer behavior. So I think it's important we all understand that. Then we're going to talk about how people are buying cars today and how that's already changed, largely driven by COVID. And then we're going to look at a brief history of different mobility models and project what that looks like in the future. So first, a little bit about me. I'm a serial entrepreneur, as mentioned, and I've started 4 companies. The one most relevant, the two, I guess, most relevant to today's discussion are Channel Advisor. So I started Channel Advisor in 2001 here in the Research Triangle Park area of North Carolina, and we went public in 2013. As an entrepreneur, that was one of my lifelong goals and very exciting to take a company public. More importantly, though, what Channel Advisor does is help brands and retailers sell online through what we call e-commerce channels. So we work closely with eBay, Amazon, Alibaba, and all the other marketplaces that are out there. So I've had 20 years in the e-commerce world, which has been very interesting to watch a traditionally analog business, the retail world, get disrupted by digital trends. In 2014, I co-founded a company called Spiffy, and what we do is on-demand car care. So just like an Uber or any other mobility, there's an application, and you can have one of our technicians come and take care of your car. Today we do washing, detailing, oil change, tires, and we're working on total car care that comes to you. So we're bringing a lot of the principles that I learned about in e-commerce to the car care industry. I mentioned before, what's really important is what are the underlying consumer behaviors that are going to govern how people buy vehicles and consume mobility. The first one is across the globe, we've seen an acceleration of digital adoption due to COVID. So in the e-commerce landscape, retail, we've seen e-commerce go from about 15% of total sales to 30% in about 18 months. A very crazy, essentially 5 years of growth in a year and a half. So a very crazy acceleration of the digital adoption. This was done due to sheltering in place and people concerned about their safety due to the pandemic. The other thing that we bring from the e-commerce world into the car care world is this idea of the convenience-oriented consumer. There's a lot of data that shows that about half the population focuses on convenience and the other half focuses on value. So we have built our company around that convenience-oriented consumer and know a lot about them. Many of you in the audience, I imagine, are Amazon Prime members. If you are very much a convenience-oriented consumer. And the way I think about it is the convenience-oriented consumer, they value their time very highly, so they will trade money for time. They will spend a little bit more for time. The value-oriented consumer is the opposite. They will spend their time to save money. Everyone has a friend that will irrationally drive 30 miles to save, a little bit of money on gasoline, for example. That's a good way to think about that framework. The other thing that's really interesting is it's very hard to change consumer behavior. To do it, people get in habits, and to change their behavior, you have to have an experience that's 10 times better. But then once you can do that, they get addicted to it. And that addiction also, if you can offer a low convenience, a very high convenient experience, it makes low convenient experiences more painful. I call that zero friction addiction. Here, I think this is a global phenomenon, but I like the Starbucks mobile app. So on my app, I can order a Starbucks a coffee, and then I just show up and it's ready. Let's say there's several days a year when that functionality is down, and now I have to go wait in line. Before the mobile app, I was happy to wait in line if there was 2 people. It was a short line. Now it feels like it takes a lifetime to get through that line. Or you're used to the Starbucks app and that approach, and then now you go to the grocery store and you have to wait in line. That addiction to low friction amplifies high friction experiences. Last, we all know mobility is going to change more in the next 20 years than it has in the last 120 years. So that's something to be aware of, and I'll touch on some of that. We have a framework we call Vehicle 2.0, which is electrification, autonomy, changing ownership models, and then also connected car. We think of those 4 things as the key drivers of that. So those are the underlying consumer behaviors that we think are going to govern how people buy mobility in the future. One of the big changes that's happening, this is a U.S.-centric view of the world, but I understand that it's kind of a global phenomenon, is it used to be that folks that sell cars, both new and used, thought the consumer will never buy a car online. They want to touch it, test drive it, etc. Well, here in the U.S., we have a company, Carvana, that has really broken that model open, and they sell primary used cars. And during COVID, they were doing really well pre-COVID, but just like you saw that e-commerce inflection in the curve, we're seeing the same thing with Carvana. Their business has accelerated very dramatically. You can look in the bottom left corner, which is the number of units they have sold, and it's gone from hundreds of units a month to tens of thousands, and so crazy growth. In fact, people are starting to call them the Amazon of car retail. So this is taken in the U.S. We have this franchise dealer infrastructure, and they have woken up to the fact that the consumer actually will buy a vehicle digitally, and they call that digital retailing. So this is where dealers are adopting digital technologies to sell vehicles to consumers. Many of them are, if you take the whole process, there's about 7 steps in buying a car, and many of them are kind of working through how to do that and doing it at various phases. So let's look at different ownership models. And I think there's 4 phases to talk about here. There's the early ownership models, which we'll call the analog birth, then analog adolescence, digital birth, and then digital future. In the early days of the vehicle, this is fun. I had to go research this. When the Model T came out, the Henry Ford Model T, it was so expensive, they actually kind of sold partial days. You could like rent it for a day, a month, a year. And it wasn't until they came out with financing that they could actually sell the vehicles in an ownership model, putting a little loan around it. So those were the early days of ownership models. Then leasing was introduced in the 50s, and then kind of a breakthrough and way ahead of its time is Zipcar. And this came from a couple of U.S. folks that went to Germany on a vacation and saw early car sharing, and they brought that back to the United States. It was good, but it lacked, because it didn't have an app and the internet, it wasn't digital. It didn't really get as much adoption as it could have. Then for me, the kind of the big kind of shot heard around the world is 2007 when the iPhone was introduced. This was the start of the digitalization of cars, and this opened up digital. So several different models. Number one is ride sharing, where someone you're kind of fractionally using someone else's car and they're driving you. We're all familiar with Uber and Lyft. So those were born right after the iPhone was introduced and enabled that. And then we now have car sharing, which is a person-to-person sharing, kind of like Airbnb for your car. Here in the U.S., the 2 biggest companies are Turo and Getaround. And then car sharing networks, where a company owns a bunch of vehicles, kind of like a fleet, and then you can fractionally use those. Another popular model that has got a lot of press, but not a lot of adoption, is digital subscriptions. And here the model would be, as a consumer, you just pay a monthly fee, and then you have an app and everything's included, and you can swap cars in and out of there. A typical example would be maybe during the week when you're taking the kids to school, you have an SUV, and then for the weekend, you're going to go on you're going to leave the kids with the grandparents and go on a fun trip, and you get the convertible, the 2-seat convertible. You can check in and out on an app. This all sounds good, but so far it's very, very expensive and hasn't seen a lot of adoption. So to recap, there's kind of 7 current ownership models that we think about, and I think this helps guide us through how are people going to consume mobility in the future. But where do we go from here? I think we're seeing a lot of adoption of car sharing networks. That's definitely kind of a really big explosion of those, and I know throughout Europe they're quite popular. So that one seems to be kind of the early winner. But what's really interesting is let's think through those changing car vehicle 2.0 trends. If we start to get more and more EVs and we solve the range anxiety in the infrastructure, and then we have autonomy, what's it mean? What does a vehicle even mean at that point, right? So today, vehicles, we pick them based on the status, the comfort of the vehicle. Maybe we've had a history with the vehicle, the brand. Well, what do those brands mean when we're no longer driving? So it's fun to think through the future. And if you think, let's put this out pretty far, like 20 years into the future. If we're in a world with autonomous vehicles, we'll probably pay by trip. So these things will be out there driving and we'll just use an app and kind of a robo-taxi model, and they'll take us wherever we want to go. We probably won't own cars. But then, the duration of the trip probably would matter. So if I'm going to be an hour in an autonomous vehicle, that's different than if, let's say, I'm going to be in a 12-hour drive from LA to New York. So maybe I think about things like, what's the entertainment of the vehicle? How is the cabin situated? Will I be alone or in a shared environment? What's the entertainment? Will I want to sleep? Will this thing have a bed in it? Will I be able to just kind of go to bed and wake up freshened in Los Angeles after a 12-hour drive? So here we kind of have a fun speculation of, you could imagine, well, if you were a 22-year-old boy going on a trip and you wanted to play Xbox the whole time, maybe there's an Xbox branded autonomous vehicle experience. Maybe you want to read and you could get in the Kindle version of this. Or maybe you want to watch some entertainment and Netflix, kind of provides your trip because it's part of your subscription to Netflix. You get the 20K, so 4K, 20K resolution, or an autonomous vehicle trip included with your subscription. Maybe at some point even Apple or any of these companies. I think mobility becomes almost part of a bundle or a revenue bundle, which a lot of people call a rundle going forward. So that's kind of fun to think through. So those are our thoughts on what we're seeing and how vehicles are going from analog to digital and what we think is going to happen in the future. Questions?
I'll be right with you, Scott.
Hi.
So thank you for all of your insights there. We have a few questions from our viewers. The first one is, what do your predictions and findings mean for the automotive industry, and what is the way forward?
Yeah, it's hard to predict. And what I can tell you from what I've seen in the e-commerce space is you had a set of retailers that said the future's coming and we need to participate in it and we're going to experiment a lot. And companies like Nordstrom and Walmart, they did really well through that disruptive period because it was part of their mindset. Another set of people on the other kind of end of the spectrum said, we're going to wait and wait and wait. And then when change happened, they weren't ready for it. And many of them did not survive. So I can't answer that question, but my advice is to, don't be scared, embrace change, experiment with it, and make sure you understand these trends so that you can decide your future and not another company or one of these trends sidelines you. Again, I come from retail and we've got a big graveyard of companies that didn't make it through that. So, Sears, Circuit City, Borders, JCPenney, there's many companies that did not survive the wave of change that came because they were stuck in their existing model.
And the second question that our viewers have for you is, will the willingness to spend a lot of money for mobility on one's own car decline, or will this prevail? And by this, I'm assuming that they mean multimodal mobility and not owning a car.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I've looked at all the models. We don't kind of have a model here at Spiffy, but I've looked at all the different models that are out there, and essentially they hang on the cost per mile. And the biggest aspect, once you go from an internal combustion engine to an EV, your cost per mile goes down about 20%. But then the biggest driver in most of these models is the autonomy. So you have to take the driver out of the equation. When you do that, you get to a price per mile that is 1/100th of the current car ownership. So that's what predicts these adoption rates, is that it would be almost fiscally irresponsible not to use a robo-taxi type of a service if the cost gets to be effectively a tenth of a penny per mile. So I think that's what's going to drive it. I think these things take generations to be 100%. I don't think any of this is 100%. I think there's shades of gray. So you're definitely going to have some folks that still want to own a car, but then they'll start to do the math and they'll say, well, do I want to put 3,000 miles on my fancy, collectible car, or do I want to take a robo-taxi? And you'll start to see the miles they consume will start to be more and more on the autonomous side and less on the self-driven side.
Okay, I thank you very much for your time. That was Scot Wingo, CEO of Spiffy.
Thanks, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your conference.
Thank you. So we are going to take a very short little break, but don't go anywhere, because when we come back, we're going to be talking about car pride. See you then.